So in this talk I'm going to talk about the worldly winds and how to respond to them more creatively. How to learn to sail the worldly winds more skillfully. So you've got this teaching of the worldly winds: gain and loss, praise and blame, fame and infamy, pleasure and pain. And these are the conditions, the changing conditions of life that just blow about and will blow in different directions as we go through our day. And the idea behind the teaching is to teach us to be more aware of them, more aware of how we might be blown about by them if we're not careful, if we're not aware, but also to teach us that we can respond more creatively, more skillful to them. We don't have to be... Our sense of happiness, our sense of contentment, our sense of equanimity doesn't have to be dependent on them. We can be happy, we can be free of the worldly winds. So in this talk I'm going to explain how we might learn to cultivate that freedom, or at least start to cultivate that freedom. And so two general suggestions. One is we can see the worldly winds as like teachers. So one is to when the worldly winds are blowing, when we become aware of them blowing around in our lives, we can just, rather than seeing them as obstacles, and especially the worldly winds that we don't like and we don't want, rather than seeing it as, oh, things have just gone wrong and this is just an obstacle to my happiness and to me getting what I want, we can see them as teachers. We can think, okay, I'm experiencing blame, or I'm experiencing loss. So this is an opportunity to practice. This is an opportunity to kind of learn how to cultivate more equanimity in my life. Yeah? So that can be a really helpful attitude, because you immediately get the initiative back. You're immediately kind of putting yourself in a more positive relationship to what's going on. Even if what's going on is something that you'd rather wasn't happening, you're creating something positive out of it. You're turning it into an opportunity. So we can view these worldly winds as like teachers that are drawing out of us a more creative, skillful response to the world. Yeah. And another way to look at it is when the worldly winds blow, we're sort of caught in a game of opposites. Yeah. So when we're experiencing loss, if we're blown about by that, we just want to gain. We're just trying to swing to the opposite. Yeah. And then when we get gain, we're still caught in a game of opposites, because even if we don't know it, it's probably somewhere deep in our being there's a kind of anxiety that things might change and we'll get lost again. Yeah? So even when we're experiencing gain, we're still sort of we're trapped in this game of opposites, as it were. So I'm going to suggest in a moment ways of practicing, ways of responding, which are about we're looking for a Dharma door out of this game of opposites, a Dharma door that kind of rises above and stops being a kind of game of swinging between opposites, gain and loss, praise and blame, and so on. Yeah. So I'm going to go through each pair of worldly winds, and I'm just going to make a suggestion for how we might do that in each case. Yeah. And the suggestions I'm coming up with are ones I've thought of, so they're not from a traditional Buddhist teaching, they're ones I've thought of. And I'm sure if you think about the worldly winds in your life, you might think of similar qualities or other qualities which would help you rise above the worldly winds and stop sort of swinging between opposites. So first of all, we've got gain and loss. And sometimes we get what we want, sometimes we don't. And we can be blown about by that. We can feel elated or despondent, confident or dejected, and so on. And my suggestion for practice with this, my suggestion for turning this into an opportunity, or seeing the Dharma door that kind of rises above, is to practice generosity. So when you're noticing the worldly winds of gain and loss blowing, you just try and practice generosity. So you try and so when we're blown about by the worldly winds of gain and loss, in a way we're relating to the situation in terms of what I want, what I can get. Yeah? And we're just trying to turn that around and relate to it in terms of, well, what can I give to this situation? How can I be generous in this situation? So a really great example of this is driving in traffic. When we drive in, especially in busy traffic, it's a kind of game of gain and loss all the time. Sometimes the light goes red, sometimes it stays green. Sometimes someone pushes out in front of you, sometimes someone lets you out. Yeah? Gain and loss, street by street. And, if we're kind of relating to that situation in terms of what I can get, what I want, just trying to get there as quickly as possible, we will probably, we'll drive in a certain kind of way, maybe quite kind of, we'll be gripping the steering wheel and gritting our teeth and getting annoyed with people and so on. But maybe we can just practice generosity. Maybe we can let people out. Maybe we can... it will make hardly any difference to our journey time, but it will improve our state of mind, and it may even have an effect of the state of mind and people around us as well. Yeah. So just relating to situations like that, just again, very everyday, ordinary situations, relating to it in terms of generosity, not playing the game of gain and loss, but rising above it into a different relationship, a different relationship to the world. Then you've got the worldly winds of fame and infamy, this desire to be liked and popular and noticed and so on. Yeah? This desire to stand out and yet also fit in, which in a way is part of the human condition. So my suggestion for turning this around is to try and practice individuality. Yeah? So rather than playing the game of fame and infamy, we try and practice individuality. We just try and base our sense of ourselves, our view of ourselves, our sense of self-metta on what really matters to us, what we really feel is of value and counts and is true and meaningful in life, as it were. So we're trying to move towards that rather than being overly dependent on what other people think, other people's approval, for our sense of self-worth and self-metta and so on. And I was reading another book when I was preparing all this material. It was a book called Status Anxiety, and it was saying that in the last few hundred years in Western Europe there was this tradition of duels between men. And literally hundreds of thousands of young men apparently died in duels. And quite often, the way a duel would come about is through somebody would do something which slighted someone else's honour. Yeah. And often it would be a very trivial kind of slight to their honour, but they felt offended and their honour had to be defended, so they would have a duel. Yeah. And often people would get injured or even killed through this. And so the guy that wrote this book was using this as an example of how attached we are to honour, to esteem, to how we appear in front of other people. Yeah? Even to, such a kind of bizarre, extreme extent as that. So I was thinking about this and thinking, that's really kind of weird. How did that kind of go on? How did that kind of work? But I realised in a way we're all like that. It is just human nature. Yeah. So, I've never asked anyone to have a duel or anything like that, but again, the example that came to mind is I've noticed a few times maybe say I'm in a queuing for someone, and then someone comes and pushes in, and one does react. One feels irritated, one feels put out, And what I found interesting thinking about this was what's irritating isn't being one place back in the queue. What's irritating is that you feel someone's got one over on you. Yeah? So it's the same thing. It's pride. It's you kind of look around thinking, well, did anyone else see them do that to me? I hope no one noticed. Yeah? It's kind of how you appear in front of other people. It really kind of affects us in that kind of way. So my suggestion is that we just try and practice individuality. We try and be ourselves and gradually learn not to let our sense of self-esteem and self-worth depend too much on the opinions of other people. Yeah? And I think the way to do this is through self-metta, to do the metta bhavana and self-metta. And I think also the way to do it is to be with others who respect us for who we are, to be with others who share those kind of values and respect us for who we are in that kind of way. Okay, third pair of worldly winds is praise and blame. Yeah. So sometimes people like what we do, sometimes they don't, they criticise it, and we feel life's not fair, but hey, it's just the way it is. We're always going to experience these worldly winds of praise and blame. So I think the antidote, the way to respond, the way to rise above swinging between opposites, is to practice truthfulness. Yeah? So we can see when the worldly winds of praise and blame blow, it's an opportunity, it's a kind of teaching to practice truthfulness. Yeah? So if you receive praise from somebody, well, just listen to it and don't bat it off, as it's what the English do especially, isn't it? We're praised, we sort of say, oh no, I'm terrible really. So don't do that, just accept the praise and think, well, what's true about that? Accept what's truthful about that praise. Yeah. Or if someone blames you for something, well again, just think, well, is there any truth in that? Even if they didn't give the blame very skillfully, even if they weren't very well intentioned, is there anything you can learn from that? Is there anything truthful in that situation which you can learn from? And then the same with giving praise and blame. Well, give praise. It's good to give praise, and do it truthfully. Do it. We have this practice of rejoicing in merits, and rejoicing in merits. Talking about someone's good qualities. It's really inspiring when it's done well. When you see somebody really kind of accurately, perceptively drawing out someone's good qualities and being able to kind of describe them and show them and celebrate them to other people. Really sort of, being perceptive and accurate in that kind of way. So kind of give praise and be truthful in that kind of way. And also be truthful if you have to give blame, if you have to criticise. Sometimes we do need to kind of criticise things. Or just try and do it truthfully. Yeah? I think often the worldly wind of blame, when we blame, it's because we're frustrated with the situation, we've lost control, and so we vent our frustration, and that's what blame is. Yeah? So that's, in a way, that's not necessarily truthful, it's just a kind of outlet for emotion. But if we do need to criticise, if we do need to give feedback, well, try not to do it in a sense of blame in that way, but just trying to kind of give helpful, constructive, truthful criticism. And then lastly, there's the worldly winds of pleasure and pain. Yeah. And just how as we go through life, inevitably, sometimes life is pleasurable, other times we experience discomfort and pain and so on. And there's a famous teaching of the Buddha of the two arrows, where the Buddha said, he was talking about painful situations in this case. He said, often when we have a painful situation, it's like an arrow has gone into us, and it hurts. But then he says, the trouble is, okay, it does hurt, that's objective. But the trouble is we then often add a second arrow to ourselves, which is like a mental arrow, a mind-made arrow. And this second arrow is, well, it might be blame, or it might be resentment, or it might be irritation, or it might be resistance, or it might be, why is this happening to me? It's not fair, and so on. So it's all those stories that we tell ourselves about the pain, which don't actually make it any better. Yeah, actually they make it worse. They just kind of resist it and resent it, and give it more energy, and make it worse, as it were. So this was the Buddha's teaching of the two arrows. Yeah? First of all, we stick this second arrow into ourselves, and we have a sort of resistance and a resentment to what's going on. And then actually, there's a bit more to the teaching. What the Buddha says we often do then is, because we've got this painful situation going on, which we've just made doubly painful, then we want to distract ourselves from it. So then we try and look for something, anything, that will distract us from this painful situation. So we look for something which is at least a bit more pleasurable. Yeah? And we just try and distract ourselves from these situations. So what I'm going to suggest, the antidote to pleasure and pain is mindfulness. Is mindfulness. Yeah? So a mindful response to those situations is when you experience the first arrow. Rather than immediately reacting to it, you just see it for what it is. You just experience that situation for what it is. And then, if you're mindful, if you're a bit more aware of the situation, you may be able to stop doing the second arrow. Even if you can't stop the first arrow, if you can take out the first arrow, great, do it. But sometimes we can't always do that straight away. But at least, if we're mindful, we don't have to do the second arrow. We don't have to kind of stick that into ourselves, as it were. We don't have to let our mind react off in all those different ways. Yeah? And we can also, if we're mindful, stay with the situation rather than immediately seeking distraction, rather than immediately trying to cover over the painful experience with some other experience, with some other distraction, as it were. Yeah? So mindfulness could be the antidote to being swung between pleasure and pain. And in the Buddha's teaching of the two arrows, he's mainly talking about painful situations. But I think this applies to pleasurable situations as well, which may seem really perverse, but I think even in pleasurable situations, you can have pleasure, but then we almost like do a second arrow with pleasure as well. Yeah? So you might be eating a really nice meal, and but instead of enjoying it, you're kind of thinking about what's going to be for pudding. Yeah? And hoping there's still going to be a portion left of that really nice cheesecake you want to eat, or whatever it is. Yeah? Or you're sitting in the cinema watching a film and you're enjoying it, but there's a little bit of you going thinking, I wonder whether I should have watched that other film. That might have been even better. Yeah? So you're not really there. Yeah? And you're slightly, a bit of you is there, but a bit of you is craving something else. Yeah? Which in a way is like a second arrow. It's mind-made in that kind of way. Yeah? And takes you away from the situation and makes it actually less pleasurable. Yeah? So again, mindfulness is the antidote to that. So that's it, yeah. You can turn the worldly winds into opportunities. When you notice them blowing about, you can see them as a spur to practice. You can see them as a trigger to bring in a new quality, a spiritual quality. Generosity, individuality, truthfulness, mindfulness. Yeah? And those qualities will just change your relationship to that situation. So rather than being swung between one and other, you'll kind of rise above, as it were. You'll be in a new relationship to those qualities. You won't be so blown about. You'll be more free. Yeah? The worldly winds may still be blowing, but inwardly, emotionally, you'll be more free in your response to them.